So I'm going to be talking to you guys today about something which I've been talking about for the last 20 years, teaching about for the last 20 years, and something that is near and dear to my heart, but that goes way back beyond those 20 years of my medical career to my childhood. And that is that I've been taught about environmental degradation since I was in elementary school back in the 1980s. And we're moving forward with the range of details in which we understand environmental degradation and the challenges to the determinants of health as you guys are learning about them in your medical school and will continue to learn about throughout your careers. But it is important to realize that a lot of these elements have been known about for a very long time and are rooted in something which a lot of people have known very intuitively. Now, it's important that I disclose that I've been advocating on environmental health issues on all levels of government over the last 20 years at least. But I don't receive anything other than occasional educational stipends by end users such as universities and whatnot. Now, when I came into medical school, I was very much encouraged, like many of you may be, to drop my holistic hat and to really focus on a lot of detailed, very practical types of techniques in order to help people overcome the illnesses in which they're suffering. But when I became a physician, it became very clear to me early on that what we were doing in our healthcare system was not sustainable. And I looked around for some evidence of that to support this feeling that I had. And lo and behold, around the turn of the millennium, the Ecosystems and Human Well-Being report from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Committee of the UN were publishing report after report on how the determinants of health were being influenced by environmental degradation. So I looked around and I said, well, is there anybody else in my community who is sensitized to this? And most people around that I spoke to were basically shrugging their shoulders and saying, you know, what can doctors do? We're just here to put on Band-Aids and to help people out, you know, one person at a time. But that wasn't the case. There were individual physicians and organizations who had already made the same diagnosis that I did, and that was that we as physicians have a larger role on how we want to impact, how we should be impacting the determinants of health. And that it was not appropriate for us to continue to participate in a system which we knew was going to fail. So when we talk about determinants of health, we're really talking about all of those things that are influencing our ability to participate in meaningful activities of living. That element which we call health and which we can measure in various ways, whether it's socially, whether it's biokinetically, whether it's emotionally, whether it's spiritually. We have a whole range of indicators for how to measure health in our individuals as well as in our communities and indeed globally. And this slide is taken from The Lancet, Journal of Psychiatry from 2018, which simply divides up the determinants of health in ways which it has been classically over the last decades, looking at, you know, demographic, economic, neighborhood, environmental, social, and really just breaking them down into what we consider to be the most commonly described elements which we believe directly impact our health. Now, what made me interested in climate and the environment was in how much it seemed to be a broad, wide-ranging element which was affecting all of us, but how difficult it was for everybody to really grasp what it was that we were talking about. Well, as I plotted further and further, it became obvious to me that the changes that we were seeing in our climate and our weather patterns over time were really just accelerating many of the stressors which we were already imposing upon ourselves. What does that mean? It means that while we were going about, you know, clearing our forests and polluting our rivers, climate change was coming along and encouraging those destructive activities as well. It was a feed-forward factor. as we continue to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide and energy into the atmosphere, it encouraged fluctuations and destabilizations in our environment, which led to further degradation of the systems which we had already damaged. So what does it look like in British Columbia? It looks like massive forest fires in areas which previously were under attack by clear cutting. It looks as extreme drought in areas which we had already been overpumping their aquifers, and so on and so forth. It already destabilizes, it would lead to increased destabilization of relationships which were already tenuous between relatively inhospitable factions in certain countries. So climate change is not something which is happening just because it seems to be a cycle that we can ascribe to nature and which has a relatively neutral effect. It seems to be amplifying many of the insults which we are already imparting onto ourselves. And as you can already begin to imagine, those insults are very frequently felt upon those most disadvantaged in our communities. So it only stands to reason that the changes in our weather patterns, the destabilization of our climate, is similarly going to impact those who are already disadvantaged in our communities. So those who are impoverished, those who are already living on the margins, individuals of visible minorities, people who are living on the streets, the mentally ill, people who are often children and women, and of course our elderly, are the ones who are going to be most hard hit by the changes incurred by climate change. So here comes COVID. So we've also been talking about the likelihood of pandemics for a similarly long time. And again, I think the first serious book that I read about oncoming pandemics was from the early 90s. And certainly there were texts that were talking about the likelihood of it happening even before then. And so knowing that we've been already predicting these pandemics to be occurring, once again, like our environmental crisis, the pandemic is unsurprisingly poorly prepared for. But at the same time, it seems to share some qualities which we see a lot with our climate crisis. What is that? That it appears to be amplifying a lot of the fragility that we've already created in our culture. Well, that's duh, Dr. Zigby, that's why we call it a crisis. Yeah, you're right, exactly. And we call it a climate crisis for exactly the same thing. So what we're seeing is one crisis which is unfolding over a period of decades, the climate crisis, again, layered underneath a much more rapid crisis, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. This photo is taken from Venezuela, where individuals are undergoing an additional shock of plummeting oil prices in a culture where they are extremely dependent upon oil revenues to maintain their economy running. So seeing individuals who are already quite fragile, secondary to their political instability, then suffer the shock of even greater economic instability, furthermore fragilized due to the fact that they have to try to socially distance and create an environment whereby they're not going to be made ill by the virus that is the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we have ourselves a hyper accelerated crisis whereby people are forced to adapt very, very rapidly to multiple challenges to their determinants of health. So we've already known, at least since the 1980s, and in all fairness, indigenous cultures have known for thousands of years how to maintain a sustainable environment. But it was most scientifically described in the 1980s by a physician hematologist who got together Nobel laureates and physicians and scientists from across Europe in the 1980s. And his name was Dr. Karl-Henrik Robert, an award-winning hematologist who in Sweden noticed increased rates of illness amongst his patients, which he found were aberrant from his early years as a practitioner, and tied it up to the effluents which were being released due to the industries close to his neighborhoods, and was able to make that association, but found that making that association was such a long and tedious, laborious affair that it was simply unlikely to be able to solve the problems of society if these types of pollution led to widespread illness. So he got together with his colleagues and said, we have to create a system by which we are not continuously generating scenarios which are self-destructive. And so to avoid self-destructive scenarios on a repeated basis, he and his collaborators, through a period of around 70 iterations, described something called the natural step. And the natural step really comes down to, after you've dug down through all the incredibly rigorous statistical research, to 4 elements. One, that you can't continue to increase the concentration of substances extracted from the Earth's crust and put it into our biosystem. Why is that? Because those are substances which have not been seen in that concentration for millions of years. And therefore, the more you increase the concentration of those substances, the less likely our biosystems are able to adapt easily and effectively. On a similar vein, you can't keep increasing the concentrations of substances produced by societies that are novel into our biosystems. Again, because our biosystems did not evolve with these high concentrations of foreign substances, you can't assume that our biosystems are going to be able to absorb them and effectively know how to deal with them. As well, our biosystems themselves have to not be degraded physically and continuously, which is something which we're seeing across the world. And of course, as we are a human endeavor, we have to make sure that we don't systematically undermine our capacity to meet our needs. And when I mean us, I'm talking about the global population. All of these factors were considered to be absolutely crucial and fundamental to creating any biologically sustainable system. Now, sustainable does not mean that there's no change. It merely means that the change can be adapted to. But sometimes you kind of feel like Saturn talking to Earth here, Dr. Saturn saying, I'm afraid you have humans. And that humans don't seem to be able to learn how to preserve their determinants of health in a way which is very effective. But is that really true? I look around me and I'm constantly seeing abundance. And I think many of us are very aware of the fact that there is an incredible abundance of production which is happening around us all the time. The question becomes, is this abundance absolutely necessary to produce in the way in which we're producing it now? And is it being distributed in a way in which will allow people to continue to sustain themselves in a way which they find meaningful? And finally, is there a way to generate somewhere near this level of abundance, or at least a level of abundance which will give us the same level of satisfaction, which will not break those 4 sacrosanct rules that I mentioned earlier? So what is climate change doing? Climate change, due to the pollutants created by the fossil fuel industry, leading to increased concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the environment, leading to massive fluctuations in weather patterns, along with a overall global warming in the realm of 1 degree centigrade globally now, near the poles upwards of around 3 degrees centigrade, is leading to wide fluctuations in our capacities to actually feed ourselves and to continue to produce products reliably. So that doesn't mean that everywhere around the world we're all we are all going hungry, but it means that we are having much more difficulty predicting whether we're going to have a successful crop, whether we're and whether we're going to have a successful crop several years in a row. So as a very interdependent, globalized economy, we're able to try to adapt to these shifts. Now, here comes COVID, and it's testing our organization patterns yet again. If we put into place a crisis whereby we now have to stay 6 feet apart, is it possible for us to actually continue to produce enough food, for example, in a destabilized climate where we're not sure which area is going to be at risk of crop failure, and be able to shift that food around rapidly enough so as to stave off widespread hunger? Right now, climate change is risking food production across the world. However, technological advances have also increased quite rapidly in a simultaneous fashion, increasing the efficiency by which those successful areas of the world are able to continue to produce their food. So this allows us to compensate for lack of or desertification, as well as overall soil degradation across the globe. But that is something which is very time limited and which makes all of us very, very nervous in the public health community. So COVID, on top of climate change, makes our very fragile system, which is essential to making sure that we can share our resources and taper or more effectively reduce the savagery in which climate change impacts individual groups of us, are now becoming more and more isolated. So on top of having climate emergencies such as hurricanes, cyclones, floodings, and fires, we now have pandemics on top of that list, which are accelerating the insults in which we have imparted upon ourselves. Can we rise to the challenge? Currently, what we're seeing are bottlenecks happening around the world, meaning that with the reduction in work capacity caused by the need for social distancing, we're seeing farmers and food producers around the world having to waste potentially record amounts of food. Now, is this something which we will not be able to adapt to in the medium term? I have enormous confidence in our creativity to restructure our system so that we can actually both produce food on a sustainable level as well as be able to transport it. But it certainly can't be done in the way in which we're organizing it right now. If we're organizing it in a way which needs many people to be doing it in a close fashion, we may be having to make difficult choices in terms of having to risk increased outbreaks of COVID-19 in the short term in order to maintain food production and to avoid starvation in some areas. So this image is one of the ironies that climate change imparts upon us. So this image was taken in Tanzania after the cyclone of 2018, I think it's Cyclone Ide, and where we see a group of forest workers who were trapped close to their site of work, secondary to the cyclone, which had washed out the road and the bridge, which was necessary for them to get back. So this is an example of how weather patterns, and savage weather patterns degrade people's capacity to continue working, even as they are participating potentially in one of the fields of work which led to these weather patterns being exacerbated. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and take some of the questions, if someone will show me how.
Uh, in the chat currently, I don't see any questions, but I just want to let the participant know if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, or you can also unmute your microphone to ask it.
So one of the other factors which is essential for us to bring up, both in terms of the determinants of health, as well as for the COVID-19, is who is being impacted. What we've already been able to demonstrate quite effectively is that across the world, it seems that majoritarily, it is of course majority world nations who are under significant financial as well as physical stress already are the ones who are being most heavily impacted. So we're seeing the greatest impacts in Southern Asia as well as in Africa, primarily. And primarily, we're seeing women being impacted more than men. Now, that's a very important element for us to be aware of and to try our best as nations and societies and communities to correct, because of the fact that women represent the majority of workers and the vast majority of our determinants of health, which are considered most direct, are actually supplied by women. And so it's essential for people to understand that in the educational community, in the direct care community, whether we think it's in the agricultural community, all three of those sectors of society are majoritarily employ women as their workforce. And women have been shown, certainly in Canada, to bear the majority of the brunt so far of the loss of jobs and the reduction in work hours, which have been brought on by COVID. So another similarity to be shown there, which we have to be extremely aware of and to fight very rampantly against. Why is that? Because we can't afford even an equal degree of harm to our women's health, given the disproportionate necessity of healthy women in order to guarantee the success of our cultures and our communities. Now, I know that sounds somewhat sexist, but the numbers don't lie. When we talk about how much work is being done by women and the essential nature of that work, it is essential that we actually prioritize women's health in order for that functioning aspect of society to continue, at least with some modicum of the effect in which it has so far. Similarly, another point which has been reportedly observed is the constructive impact of female leaders on the COVID response. When we take a look at the countries who appear to have responded most rapidly and most effectively, you see a very interesting mix of positive and relatively slow responses in nations which are run by men. But when we take a look at the nations which have female leaders, we see a much more rapid and majoritarily positive response to the COVID crisis. What does that mean? It means, yeah, some men have done a very good job leading their countries through this crisis, but many men have not. Whereas the relatively small number of female leaders have, in vast majority, seem to have responded more rapidly and more effectively to this specific crisis. Is there something to be learned about this for our climate crisis as well? So I just had to put in this joke, which I saw from the New Yorker, but it I'm very often struck by how often my female leaders in my own institution, health institution, have come up with the vast majority of solutions which are currently being implemented effectively in response to this crisis. With my male colleagues, while we have had multiple excellent ideas and have implemented them very well, it suffices to say that the majority of the wide-ranging and impactful changes have occurred secondary to my female colleague leaders. Now, how does this all impact other determinants of health, such as transport? Well, certainly, as we saw in that last picture of our Tanzanian workers who were stranded secondary to their roads being washed out, climate change is certainly predicted to have a massive impact on transportation worldwide. Why is that? Because of the fact that the majority, or I should say about 30 to 50% of our world population in our most dense financial and economic centers are situated along coastlines around the world, and both storm surges as well as ocean expansion and ocean level rise are going to be challenging that wide range of very important coastline road structure, as well as boating industry, and will lead to further disruptions of transportation of global products. Now, once again, here comes the COVID crisis. So how does that add on to the complexity? Very rapidly, it forces us to only adopt scenarios whereby we can maintain a certain amount of distance while we're trying to travel. And so we would have to now create systems by which we can more effectively travel virtually, like what we're doing today, as well as integrate more constructively into our communities, which is another principle which climate change was pushing us towards previously. So reducing the need for long distance travel and increasing the capacity for people to travel perhaps actively in order to be able to continue to function is going to be one of the major challenges which is going to be offered by both climate change as well as the COVID crisis. So many of the challenges are multiplicative, meaning before we were pushing for for increasing public transit, increasing access to have active transport. Well, now we're focused even more locally, so that we're looking at how can we continue to only exist as much as possible within our local communities. And that is a challenge which we are all taking up very, very seriously. So we're seeing significant resistance around the world to this whole idea of social distancing, but by and large, its efficacy at limiting the pandemic has been proven. Is it going to be adaptable in the medium term or long term remains to be seen. But similarly to those 4 sustainability principles that we saw before, which are very effective for looking at how we can potentially limit climate change, the way in which to limit our COVID crises is similarly rather simplistic if we can actually apply those rules. What are those rules for limiting the pandemic? Wash your hands frequently, maintain a social distance, wear a mask. If you can do those 3 things and integrate them into whatever tasks that you actually have to accomplish, those 3 limiting factors are very simple but important design elements which are now going to be incorporated around the world very, very rapidly. Whether it's from education, whether it's from farming, whether it's in our factories, those elements are going to be incorporated across the world. What it demonstrates is how rapidly we can actually adapt to these scenarios. So does COVID and the risks that it's demonstrated on our determinants of health make me despair or make me inspired about our ability to act? Well, in fact, it makes me very inspired. Why is that? Because out of this tragedy of so much life lost, and as I've been working over the last month in the hospitals, there is a significant amount of life lost secondary to this COVID crisis. So much of the reflexes that we're building into ourselves in responding to this rapid insult are the same reflexes that we're going to be using in order to try to tackle climate change. The challenge becomes, are we going to be able to do it in enough time and change the way in which we work and produce objects enough to avoid the worst elements of climate change and be able to sustain our world effectively? And with that, I will leave you and open the discussion amongst our partners.
We have a question here from Bailey Crowley, who asks, is there any reasons being suggested as to why female leaders are responding to this crisis better than their male counterparts?
So there is, and again, this is in the social science realm. This is not something which can be tested in a laboratory. So these are observations and various elements which seem to be working within that. Number one, it seems as if the female leaders seem to be more likely to actually listen to scientists more readily, and they seem to respond more to the scientific information in a way which their male counterparts seem to a larger percentage resistant to. So that's a very interesting observation. So they seem to be more apt to respond scientifically and be more likely to listen to the specialists. So there is that element. The other element is they appear to be more likely to take the harder choices, which we find very interesting, and particularly unpopular choices. So there's been various theories as to why there is a self-sacrificial or politically sacrificial risk which they're willing to take, which many of their male counterparts do not seem to have the same willingness to take as rapidly. And that's something which there's been a lot of debate upon. But they call it the glass cliff, meaning they feel damned if they do, damned if they don't. And so they decide to choose what they think is the best for society, knowing that they will likely suffer political repercussions either way. There's several other elements that have been described in terms of what goes into it. Some of them are much more sort of genetically based arguments, talking about the likelihood of women to be able to actually perceive more effectively the ramifications of those decisions on the population, the greater likelihood of their empathy to the suffering populations. Again, these are sociobiological explanations, which I don't necessarily feel are absolute, but I think what we're seeing are the trends. And the trends demonstrate that the female leaders seem to be much less likely to make the big mistakes that we're seeing with many of the male leaders.
Okay, so we have another question here in the chat from Alexander Valerio, who's asking, considering how local health in certain areas can be greatly strained by global influences on climate change, what can be done on the local level to help with crises?
So, those are excellent points. So the number one point is that you're always going to be a little bit victim of chance when it comes to climate change, meaning that because it's a global issue, it can't be solved on a local level. What you can do on a local level, however, is very much ramp up the sensitivity of your local leaders, your municipal leaders particularly, about what is necessary in order to increase climate resilience, meaning how do you make sure that if there is a crisis which occurs, similar to the COVID crisis, that the community has a way of organizing itself in order to get resources to the people who need it most. So that's what we call resiliency building. So that's one element that you can engage your municipal government on. Number two, you can certainly engage your health institutions, if you work in a health institution or you're soon going to work in a health institution, on how to make themselves climate resilient and to ensure that they actually are reducing their environmental impacts and looking at how they actually improve the society's capacity to function without damaging the environment. Our healthcare institutions, where you guys will be directly involved in, have a massive influence on the community. And harnessing your administration to buy locally, to buy more sustainably, and to encourage more sustainable transportation methods is going to make a massive impact on your community. Finally, don't be afraid to support one of the local groups that you think are doing excellent work, whether it's for whatever way in your community, whether it's to improve the food stability, so the access to food in your community, or whether it's improving the access to active transport like bicycle lanes. But adding a physician's voice or a medical student's voice is even more powerful to these organizations will amplify their impact tenfold.
Okay, so we have another question from the chat from Robert Morris-Gill, who's asking, what is your opinion on the reduction in carbon emissions from this pandemic, and going forward, will it impact or slow the climate crisis?
So I'm going to show you another, thank you very much. Who asked that question?
Robert Morris-Gill.
Thank you very much, Robert, because that's a tie into one of my next slides. Right here. So if you take a look at this slide, it maps out since the 1960s various global crises. From the first oil crisis in the 1970s, the second oil crisis in the 1980s, the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the Asian financial crisis, the big bubble of 2000, as well as the global financial crisis of 2010. What it demonstrates is that you do see in each one of these global economic crises a downturn in terms of global emissions in the very short term. That means, for 1 or 2 years. But it is not demonstrated to have a long-term reduction in global carbon dioxide equivalent reduction. So my short answer to you is if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, of this opening up of everybody's minds to the possibility that we have to change things and make those changes happen right now. Right now is the time that we have to be talking to our leaders. Every one of us getting off of this chat today has to be calling a municipal, provincial, federal, or state leader to tell them that they absolutely have to be investing in climate-oriented solutions while they're focusing upon restarting their economies. That if we lose this opportunity, we lose enormous valuable time, because those are resources which are going to be allocated in the very near future.
Thank you, Dr. Zigby. Another question from the chat from Jamila Saad. How do you see the return back to normalcy after this COVID crisis, and how can you use it as an opportunity for a greener society?
So normalcy is something which is going to become less and less apparent as we go forward in the future. Both climate change is accelerating how rapidly the world is going to be changing in front of us. Our technological advances is going to be changing how rapidly our world is going to appear in front of us. And this pandemic as well on top of it is a hyper accelerator of the change which we're going to be seeing. So I want people to begin seeing normalcy as a quaint idea for the future which is unfolding. Normalcy is not something which I want anybody to be holding on to as a concept. What I think is much more useful as future leaders, and you are all future leaders, is the concept that you have to take the best from history and apply it to the challenges which you're going to rapidly be facing in the future. The COVID crisis is one of those crises which we're going to be trying to turn into opportunities. And with your help in influencing your decision makers, we will be able to turn it into an opportunity. But there is no normalcy which is coming back. We are going to be having to face new rules on how to maintain social distance for the foreseeable future. We're going to have to get used to wearing masks, and we're going to have to get used to washing our hands very, very regularly. We are also going to have to get used to the risks associated with living with our elders, knowing that we have to surround them with a certain number of people who are able to care for them. We are going to be living with higher risk for the near term. We're going to be living with the ability to respond more rapidly in the moderate term. And if we play our cards right, we're going to be living more sustainably in the long term.